Hi everyone, welcome to Module 12. In this module, we're talking about visual aids and presentation aids. These can be anything from a PowerPoint to a flip chart to a prop that you're using. In this course for your persuasive policy speech, you'll use some kind of slide deck. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a PowerPoint that you made in Microsoft Office, but it needs to be a slide deck of some type. So you can use a Google slide presentation or Canva, and there are a couple other ones that we'll talk about. But we're going to cover what makes for a good presentation aid, what you need to consider as you're giving a speech with one, and how to go about approaching your persuasive slide deck in particular, but also any kind of professional deck that you have. You'll notice right off the bat that this slide is way more involved and colorful than our typical intro slide. And this PowerPoint in and of itself is far more visually involved and appealing. And so it's there for your use as well, just as an example of what looks pretty exciting and animated like this intro slide does. And then some of the later slides are a little more subdued, what you're used to seeing, and how to strike a balance between the two. So first, if you had to sing a karaoke song, what would it be? Take a second to think about this. Think about why you would pick this song, why you'd pick it over other songs, and why you think it's a good fit for your audience. There's also a lot of SpongeBob in this PowerPoint because cartoons are a great example of good visual communication, right? Art is good visual communication, whether or not it means to be. But when we have animated characters like SpongeBob and Sandy here, they have nonverbals just like you and I do. They move their mouth when they speak, and it's much the same when you make your PowerPoint. It should also be aiding you in communicating beyond just what you can do with your voice and your body. So in chapter 19, you can read quite a bit about speaking with presentation aids. This chapter was geared more towards the foundational aspects, why we do it, how we do it, and then chapter 20, 21 are more technical. But in chapter 19, they talk about what is a model, what is a prop, pictures, graphs, when is it appropriate to use audio. This course is a little different in that you are presenting online. And so in some ways, it makes it easier for you to set up some of these things. It makes it very easy for you to just click a button and play some audio. Whereas if you were standing at a podium in someone else's building, that might be more complicated. But it does make it a little bit harder to do things like pass a prop around to your audience or use a scale model if you're just this little square in the corner of your screen. So something to think about there is that you can't just take what's in the book as is for this chapter. You have to think about, okay, that makes sense, but how would it work online? Some basic design rules, and you can refer to chapter 20 for these. A lot of them are pretty common sense. The 6x6 rule is not a steadfast rule, but it is a really good suggestion and a good place to start when you're making your PowerPoint. And that's to aim for 6 words per line, 6 lines per slide, no more than that typically. And again, if you're using a quote and you've got a picture off to the side, you may have 8 short lines so that they don't run over your picture. And that's fine. When they say 6 lines, they mean 6 full lines of text all the way across the slide. Use emphasis carefully, otherwise it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense to use highlight here over use. we've got some italics, some bold, some underline, some all caps, some bold, underline, italics, all caps. There's a lot going on here, right? And we don't want to do that unless it's going to emphasize part of our point, or if you're pulling from a longer quote that you're citing and you care about a few words in particular and you want to bold those, just make sure that you use this kind of emphasis sparingly, and that when you are using it, it's purposeful and it makes sense. This one feels kind of obvious, but you got to say it anyways. No cursive lettering fonts unless it's a title. Even then, I would recommend not doing that. No Comic Sans or any other kind of playful fonts. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but almost like fonts for kids or something that you wouldn't consider professional, like wingdings, or the kind of stylized fonts that you see in Microsoft Word where it's like dinosaur letters. Just make sure that it is easy to read up close and from afar. In terms of software, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but you've got lots of options. PowerPoint, Canva, Google Slides, these are both great because they're online. You should have PowerPoint on your computer. You can have PowerPoint through the university if you don't, so make sure you download your student software package. If you are a Mac user, you might do Keynote. Visme, I've never personally used, but some people like that. That one's online as well. And then Prezi, which is also online. So almost all of these are digital online apps versus PowerPoint and Keynote, which you will operate usually directly from your computer. But that's another thing too I always forget about. You have access to PowerPoint online through the university. So everyone has access to multiple presentation aids, or aid makers rather, and you're going to pick the one that works best for you as you work on your Module 12 learning activity and also your persuasive policy speech presentation. Remember that you're giving a speech, not a slideshow. You're giving a speech that you have a slideshow to emphasize, but when it comes down to it, somebody should still be able to listen to you and understand without your PowerPoint. And you're not there to read the PowerPoint to them. You're there to give a speech and use the PowerPoint to emphasize things that are easier to understand with a visual, or something you really want them to remember, so you want them to see it and read it for themselves. As always, practice going from slide to slide, practice opening it and sharing your screen and closing it and stopping the recording, doing all those things that you need to do for your recorded speech and screen share. Make it interesting. Nobody wants to look at a boring PowerPoint. Oftentimes the PowerPoints in this course, like those that you've seen before this one, are pretty cut and dry, and that's because they're standardized, they're a part of the curriculum for the textbook, but they're not something that I would say you would want to use if you were presenting to an audience. And I'm going to show you an example here in a second of one that I used for an audience and as I was presenting it, and not necessarily as a lecture guide. It's part of what the PowerPoints in this course do too, is double as notes as well. So I would base them, if anything, more on this PowerPoint than previous PowerPoints. And as always, I say this every time, don't forget to cite material. If it's not yours, if you didn't come up with it and doesn't belong to you, we need to know where it came from and who it does belong to. As you're making your PowerPoint to go along with your speech, start with your outline, get your outline set, and then decide, where can I add emphasis with visuals? How many slides am I going to need? How can I arrange them effectively so that it makes sense as I move from one to the next, as I transition from one piece of my speech to the next, and I'm still going in the right direction and hitting all the points I need to hit? It seems pretty self-explanatory, but I know that for some of you, particularly if you're in a STEM discipline, don't do this kind of presentation often, and so it's always good to have a reminder. As always, abide by any kind of copyright restrictions. If you're presenting for class, you have a little bit of leeway because we have what's called fair use, which means that for the sake of education and learning, you can use some copyrighted material like SpongeBob. But if you're presenting on, I don't know, if you go live on Facebook or something, it doesn't apply anymore, right? You're not doing it for class. And it's just something to consider. And then your textbook talks more about what is the difference between a copyright and a trademark. How do we know when something is fair use or common knowledge, or how do I cite a picture? All of those things are available to you in your book. And also, I would recommend visiting some of the library's resources as well. Some visual representations of what to do and what not to do. Light text on a light background. We can't see it. Dark text on a light background is good, but we want to make sure that it's the right size. So if it's itty bitty and we can't see it, that's not going to have any visual impact. If it's giant and distracting, that's too much, right? So you want to go for middle ground, like this top bullet point here. Light text on a dark background, great, very easy to read. Dark text on light background at an appropriate size, good. If you have a visual that you want to include, make sure you put it on a part of the slide that makes sense. For example, this SpongeBob is down here in the corner, but if we put it in the middle, almost kind of to the left, and then put our text over here, it's a little distracting because it doesn't make sense as to why we've arranged it that way. So just go with some standard design rules. Now, let's revisit your karaoke song. Why did you pick it? Visual presentations are most comforting to you when you're familiar with them. So it's part of practice, but also including things that you think are the best representation of your speech. And people like the familiar, and they like when things are appropriate. So make sure that you're thinking about this as a professional presentation, that you're using consistency in both your design and with your speech, right? You want to be saying what you're showing, or at least relating the two, right? You don't want to be just reading a slide. That's not what that means, but you do want to be saying something about what it is that you are representing with your slides. And just think of it as all the same rules that you would use if you're making a handout for someone. You don't want to include anything that you don't want them to know, and vice versa. If you want them to know it, it needs to be included. Some final thoughts for persuasive policy speech slide preparation and for your Module 12 learning activity slide prep. Get to work on it. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's not something you could just throw together in 5 minutes. Practice, practice, practice. Remember that consistency is key. If all of your slides look pretty similar, then that's fine. They don't have to all be their own thing. They need to have some cohesion there. So don't panic if you're like, oh, they're not super unique from each other. That's okay, as long as the information is unique per slide. And also, if you don't know how to share your screen on Zoom or Teams or Screencast-O-Matic or whatever it is that you use, please learn to do that before your persuasive policy speech, because my expectation is that you will give a speech with a presentation aid. And Zoom, I think, is probably the easiest one to do that. If you have some other online classes, particularly those of you who with synchronous classes, you've probably had to share your screen or watch someone share screen in Zoom. I personally don't have any experience with Teams presentations, but if that you prefer to use that and you need help, I'm happy to try to help troubleshoot with you. They've got a good website and they've got a lot of good resources there. And then also in Blackboard, I've provided the Screencast-O-Matic link, and there's a guide for that. Both of those links are in the Module 12 Learning Activity folder. But again, use what works best for you. If you're a Zoom person, use Zoom. If you're a Teams person, use Teams. You might even use maybe a photo booth app on a Mac. I don't know if you can share a screen with that or not. But however it is that we can see both you and see and hear you, and then also your presentation aid, that's what I need from you for your persuasive policy speech. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to open another PowerPoint. Slowly but surely. And show you one that I actually used to present the other day that kind of breaks some of the design rules that we talked about earlier, but there's a reason. So you can see I have a title slide, which you should have. I have animated some of these elements because if it just opened like this, there's a lot of text, right? So I break it up by covering the left and then covering the right. As you can see, bullet points are your friend. If they apply, use them. Here I've used italics to emphasize where the citation is for this quote, and not so much something in the quote, but just to distinguish it from that block of text. Use animation sparingly, but again, I use it to hide things so that my slide isn't so cluttered. Here I've used some bold to emphasize pieces of this block of text. Here I've used color. Again, this is still dark enough that you can see it on that light background. Here we have light text on a dark background. This obviously violates likely the 6x6 rule, but it's unavoidable in this situation. So, but I think it's still visually clear. So you can use that kind of judgment when you're making your presentation. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words, but that's not a ton. That's not a whole sentence there. So it's really just about balance and clarity and not just pasting a big block of text onto the slide. Here I've done the same thing where I've hidden things with animation because it's overwhelming to open the slide and see all of this at the same time, right? So that just gives you another idea of what a PowerPoint can look like and still be interesting and functional. And that's what I want to see from you. Interesting and functional. You can do it. It's going to be great. I'm really excited to see what you all come up with. As always, let me know if you have questions or you want to talk about your PowerPoint or how to screen share. I am happy to talk to you about it in office hours, or you can make an appointment at a different time and we'll go over it. Otherwise, until then, be well and I'll see you soon.